I want to show you what these verses in 1 Peter chapter 2 are all about. In the book of 1 Peter, Peter addresses people in different walks of life. He addresses here citizens in a country, but he's going to address servants, he's going to address wives and husbands, he's going to address youth, and to each group of people he has instructions. In this text here, Peter addresses citizens. What instructions is he going to have for citizens? Well, what we find is that Peter instructs the citizens in a given country to submit or to be subject to their governing authorities. Now, here's the thing about Christians. A Christian is a citizen of heaven. And so that makes them here on earth an exile. And we've seen that a couple times. Most recently, we saw that in verse 11. Since we're citizens in heaven, we are now on earth sojourners and exiles. And so a Christian is kind of in an interesting place. Our citizenship is in heaven, and yet we live on earth in different countries under different governments. And so how do Christians relate to the government where they live when really they're an exile and a sojourner? Well, that's what this text is all about. Listen to verse 13 and 14, where Peter gives his instructions. He says, "Be subject, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good." The main word here, the main instruction here to Christians, to citizens, is this: be subject. To be subject is to submit, it's to obey. And it's really important, I think, in understanding this to see how Peter, in 1 Peter, uses the word be subject. Here, as he's writing to citizens, he says be subject to your government, like emperor and governors. So citizens are to be subject. But in just a couple verses, in verse 18, he's going to address servants, and he's going to tell them, servants, be subject to your masters. And then in chapter 3, he's going to address wives, and he's going to say, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands. And then in the last chapter of the book, he's going to address youth. He says this: likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Okay, so be subject, be subject, be subject, be subject. This is kind of a theme in the book of 1 Peter. So in our text, Peter is addressing citizens. And here's his instructions to citizens. Citizens are to be subject to their governing authorities. Christians are to obey the authority of the government that's over them. So like I mentioned earlier, Peter mentions two kinds of officials in government, of human institutions, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him. In Peter's day, there was the emperor, and then he would send out governors, and these governors would be his representatives, and they had kind of a twofold purpose: to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Now, this is kind of a clear instructions. What are we to do? Christians are to submit or to be subject to their governing authorities. But what about why? Why should we do this? Why should we obey our government, those in authority over us? Here's the reason: for the Lord's sake. So be subject for the Lord's sake. This is very similar to what Paul says in Ephesians 5:21, where he says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Do you hear the same idea there? Submitting with respect to Christ, out of reverence to Christ for the Lord's sake here. When Christians submit to the authority that God has placed over them, they honor Christ. Not ultimately because the leader over them is anything great. It's just they do it because they seek to honor Christ. Now, that raises this question. Why does submitting to government honor Christ? The reason why being subject to your government honors Christ, or you do it for the Lord's sake, is because God is the one who establishes leaders in government. Romans chapter 13 verse 1 says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." So if God has set the leader in place, we obey, not because the leader's so great, but because of the Lord's sake, because the Lord established that leader. If mom and dad leave the house and they put the oldest sibling in charge, the younger siblings obey the older sibling. Why? Out of reverence to their parents. The parents put that authority in place, and so that's my motivation. Even if I disagree with the older sibling, that's my motivation for obeying, for the parents' sake. So too, we are subject to the governing authorities for the Lord's sake. Now, this raises legitimate questions for Christians. What happens if the person in charge commands me to do something that is sinful? This actually happened to Peter. Do you remember this in Acts chapter 4? He stands before the Sanhedrin and they command him. They say, "You must no longer preach about Jesus." And do you remember what Peter, the guy who's writing "Be Subject," do you remember what Peter said? Acts 4:19, "But Peter and John answered and said to them, 'Whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge. For we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard.'" So Peter, the guy who's writing these words, when he was told to disobey God, he says, "I've got to obey God rather than you." So if the government asks you to sin, you obey the higher authority. You're still under authority. It's just you're under ultimately God's authority, and so you obey Him. Otherwise, Christians are to submit to our governing authorities. Now, what happens if you have a leader that you don't respect who is in government? What if you have a leader who does not love the Lord? Well, there are two things to keep in mind. One, when Peter is writing this, Rome was not friendly to Christians. I mean, think about Nero. Second, later in the book, when Peter commands servants and wives to submit to their authorities, he addresses this very question. What do you do about submitting to ungodly leaders? Servants, as we see this in just a couple verses here, notice what Peter says to servants. "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust." And then he gives the reasons, and we'll look at that as we get into the book more. But then when Peter addresses wives, kind of a similar idea. Wives are to be subject even to the husband who does not obey the word. And so I think we see kind of a similar theme here as Peter is addressing citizens. What do we do when we have a leader that we're under who doesn't fear the Lord? Well, we still submit to them until the point where they call us to sin. We are to submit for the Lord's sake to the government that has legitimate jurisdiction over us. All right, that brings us to verse 15. So the emperor sends out, he's the one who sends out the governors, and their job is to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. Well, guess what? It just so happens here in verse 15 that it's God's will for you to do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good, and Christians are to be those who do good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Now, this should sound familiar to you because in just a couple verses before, we hear something very similar. "Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers." they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. In other words, who are the ignorant people and the foolish people that Peter's addressing? They're the people that look at Christians and they speak against Christians and say, those Christians, they're the evildoers. And so down here in verse 15, Peter's saying, when we do good, we put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. In other words, think of it like this. When someone looks at a Christian and says they are an evildoer, but that Christian has a reputation of doing what is good, that silences the foolish people. And so I think here's a good question to ask yourself. Do you have a reputation for doing good among outsiders? Now, what are the good things we're to do? Certainly, in this context, part of what we do good in a culture is we set the example of we obey our governing authorities. And so we have a reputation as Christians of doing that. Two more verses here in this section. Verse 16, live as people who are free. What a great description of a Christian. A Christian is free. We're free from the authority of sin. We are free from the law of Moses. Yet, we are not to use our freedom as a cover-up for evil. We're not to just say, I can do whatever I want, even sin. No, we need to remember we are to live as servants of God. Then in verse 17, we get kind of these four rapid fire commands. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So, honor everyone. Every human is made in the image of God. Every human, since they're in God's image, deserves a basic level even of honor. Even someone who is a criminal, we don't treat them like we treat an animal. We still treat them as a human. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Christians should have a profound love for one another. We're to fear God. He's the ultimate authority. And he put the emperor in place. And so because of that, we honor the emperor. All right, well, that's this text. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we will see you again next time.